My name is Renee Castellan. I'm 33 years old, and 3 weeks ago I sat through my brother's wedding reception at a table shoved so far into the corner that a waiter had to ask me to lean forward every time he needed to get past with a tray. 200 guests filled that ballroom in Cedar Falls, crystal glasses catching the light, a string quartet playing something soft and expensive near the dance floor. My parents sat at table 1, front and center, beaming like they'd built the whole evening with their own hands. I sat at table 16, tucked behind a support column, between a second cousin I hadn't spoken to since middle school and an empty chair that was supposed to belong to a +1 I didn't have. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not a woman who complains about seating charts. I've spent 12 years with my arm inside a horse up to the shoulder at 3 in the morning, turning a foal that's coming out sideways, so a folding chair by the kitchen door was never going to break me. What broke something in me that night wasn't the table. It was what I found sitting on it when the salad course came out, tucked under my napkin like someone wanted me to find it quietly, without a scene. It was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, the kind of paper you get from a bank. My name was printed at the top in a font too clean to be anything but official. Underneath it, a loan guarantee for $60,000, dated 8 months earlier, with a signature at the bottom that was supposed to be mine. I have signed my name more times than I can count, on surgical consent forms, on clinic leases, on the mortgage for the little brick house I bought 2 years ago with money I earned scrubbing in on emergency colic surgeries at 2 in the morning. I know exactly what my signature looks like, and the one on that page was close enough to fool a loan officer who'd never met me, but wrong in the one place that mattered. The loop on the R curled in the wrong direction. I had never seen that document before in my life. I sat there in my navy blue dress, with a fork halfway to my mouth, and the room kept moving around me. Laughter at the next table, someone clinking a glass, the bride, my new sister-in-law, Paige, laughing too loudly at something my brother Colton whispered in her ear at the head table. My mother caught my eye from across the room and gave me that smile she's perfected over 30 years, warm on the surface, with something colder underneath that only I seem able to read. She lifted her champagne glass an inch in my direction, like she was toasting me, like she knew exactly what was sitting under my napkin and wanted to watch my face when I found it. I folded the paper back into thirds. I set my fork down, and for the first time in longer than I can remember, I did not feel the old reflex rise in me, the one that says stay small, stay quiet, don't make this harder for everyone else. I felt something else entirely. I felt calm in the specific way you feel calm right before you cut into a patient who's already flatlining twice on the table, when the panic has nowhere left to go, so it just turns into focus. Before I tell you what I did next, if you've ever sat at the back table of your own family's celebration and felt invisible in a room full of people who share your last name, I want you to hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now, because I read every single one, and knowing there are people out there who understand exactly what that folding chair felt like matters more to me than you know. I reached into the leather bag I'd brought, the plain black one that didn't match my dress on purpose, because I had known, somewhere underneath the part of me that still wanted to believe otherwise, that I might need it that night. Inside was a folder, unremarkable, the kind you'd use for tax documents or a mortgage refinance. I had built that folder over 3 weeks of quiet, careful work, late nights after clinic hours with a desk lamp and a legal pad, phone calls to a bank in another county, a conversation with a lawyer named Marguerite Aldous who had looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Renee, whatever you decide to do with this, you do it on your own terms, not theirs." I had listened to her. I had waited, and now the moment had arrived early, sitting under a linen napkin at table 16, 3 weeks before I had planned to open that folder at all. I stood up. My chair scraped against the hardwood floor loud enough that a few heads turned, the way heads always turn when something in a room shifts even slightly off its expected rhythm. I walked the length of that ballroom past the string quartet, past the dance floor, past 200 guests who had no idea what they were about to witness, and I stopped directly beside my mother's chair at table 1. She looked up at me, still smiling that smile, and said, "Sweetheart, is everything all right?" In a voice pitched just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, the voice of a woman performing concern for an audience. I set the folder down on the white tablecloth beside her wineglass. I did not open it yet. I just let it sit there, thick and quiet and undeniable, while the room around us slowly, table by table, began to notice that something had gone very wrong with the evening. My father's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. My brother Colton, up at the head table in his rented tuxedo, went pale in a way I had never once seen in 30 years of watching him talk his way out of every mess he'd ever made. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could hear my grandmother Vivian's voice, the way I still hear it sometimes when I'm alone in the clinic at night, telling me the summer I turned 14, that the day would come when this family showed me exactly who they were, and that when it did, I should not raise my voice. I should tell the truth, calmly, once, and let the silence afterwards do the rest of the work for me. That silence was about to arrive, and what came out of that folder over the next 20 minutes would end my parents' marriage to their own story about who I was, and it would end it in front of every single person they had ever wanted to impress. To understand why I set that folder down instead of screaming, you have to go back with me to a kitchen table in Millbrook, Ohio, 21 years earlier, because that is where the math of my family first started, and it never once changed for the next 2 decades. I was 12 years old, and my brother Colton was 9, and our mother Diane had a system for love that she never once admitted to out loud, but that I understood the way you understand weather, by feeling it land on you over and over, until you stop expecting anything different. Colton broke things, and got new things. I made things, and was told to be careful with them. That was the whole shape of my childhood in a single sentence, and it took me most of my adult life to say it that plainly, even to myself. My father Frank ran a small hardware store on Route 9, the kind of place with creaking wood floors and a bell over the door that had been there since before either of us was born. He worked long hours and came home tired, and whatever attention he had left over at the end of the day went to Colton, because Colton was loud and needed managing, and I was quiet and did not. I learned early that quiet children get overlooked in a house where the squeaky wheel gets the oil, and I learned to be very, very quiet, because at least being overlooked felt safer than being a problem. I brought home a report card in 7th grade with 5 A's and 1 A-, and my mother glanced at it at the kitchen counter, said, "That's nice, honey," and turned back to the stove where she was making Colton's favorite dinner because he'd had a rough day at school after getting suspended for fighting. That was the pattern. Colton got suspended, and there was a family conversation about it, concern, and a trip to get ice cream afterwards because he needed comfort. I got a perfect attendance award in 4th grade, and nobody came to the little assembly where they handed it out. I don't tell you this to make you feel sorry for a 12-year-old who's now 33 and doing just fine. I tell you because you need to understand the account that was already being kept in that house long before any bank was ever involved. An account where every deposit I made went unnoticed and every withdrawal Colton made got covered without question, and where nobody in the family seemed to realize that accounts like that eventually come due. The one person who ever balanced that ledger honestly was my grandmother Vivian, my father's mother, who ran 12 acres of apple orchard on the edge of town that had been in the family since before the war. Every Saturday morning from the time I was 10 years old, she picked me up in her old Ford pickup with the bench seat that smelled like cedar and cut grass, and we spent the day together among the trees, and later, at her kitchen table with the ledgers spread out where she taught me, patiently and without ever making me feel small for not already knowing, how to read a column of numbers and understand what story it was actually telling. Vivian did not believe in soft math. She used to say that numbers are the one thing in this world that refuse to lie to you, even when everyone around you is lying constantly, and that if you ever want to know the truth about a person, you should stop listening to what they say and start looking at where their money goes. She saw me in a way nobody else in that family ever bothered to. She noticed when I skipped lunch, because there hadn't been money left over after Colton's baseball equipment that month. She noticed when I wore the same 2 pairs of jeans through an entire school year, while Colton had a closet full of things he outgrew before he ever wore them twice. She never said a cruel word about my parents in front of me, not once, but she started quietly doing things instead, slipping me $20 bills folded into birthday cards, buying me a used laptop for school, when my parents said there wasn't room in the budget, sitting me down the summer I turned 14, and telling me something I did not fully understand until I was standing in that ballroom 20 years later, holding a folder full of proof. She told me that this family runs on a story they've all agreed to believe, that Colton is the one worth investing in, and Renee is the one who'll be fine no matter what, and that stories like that always survive right up until the moment somebody with the truth decides to stop protecting everyone else's comfort. She said the day would come, maybe not for years, when they would show me exactly who they were, in front of people who mattered to them, and that when that day arrived, I would not need to shout or cry or explain myself, because the truth, laid out calmly and completely, is louder than any argument anyone has ever won by raising their voice. I was 14 years old, sitting across from her at that kitchen table with apple crates stacked against the wall, and I remember thinking she was talking about something far away, something abstract, the kind of warning grown-ups give you that you file away without really believing you'll ever need it. I needed it exactly 19 years later in a ballroom in Cedar Falls, and I did not raise my voice once. What Vivian gave me on those Saturday mornings was not just comfort, though God knows I needed it. She gave me a skill that nobody else in my family ever thought to value, an eye for numbers that don't add up, a patience for sitting with documents until they told you their real story, instead of the story someone wanted you to believe. She used to quiz me on the Orchard's books, the way other grandmothers might quiz a grandchild on multiplication tables, pointing to a column and asking me what it meant that this expense jumped in October, but the corresponding invoice was dated in August, and I learned to find the gap between what a document said and what actually happened, because Vivian taught me that gap is where the truth always hides. By the time I left for college at 18, I had 2 things my parents never gave me and never seemed to notice I'd gotten from somewhere else entirely. I had a work ethic built from years of being the child who had to earn everything twice, once through the effort itself, and once again just to get anyone to notice the effort at all, and I had a grandmother's eye for the exact kind of paper trail that a family desperate enough and entitled enough might eventually leave behind when they decided the invisible daughter had finally become useful to them again. I did not yet know exactly how I would need those 2 things. I only knew, the way you know a storm is coming from the particular stillness in the air, that someday I would. I left Millbrook the week after I turned 18, with $400 I'd saved from 2 years of scooping ice cream at the counter on Route 9, and a scholarship letter from Ohio State that my parents had signed without ever once asking what it would cost me to get there. Nobody drove me to campus. My father had a delivery to make that day, some big order for a contractor 2 towns over, and my mother said she'd hate to leave Colton alone on a weekend since he had a scrimmage, and so I loaded 2 duffel bags and a box of textbooks into the back of a friend's hatchback and rode 2 hours north listening to the radio, because neither of us knew what to say to fill the silence. I remember looking back once, as we pulled out of the driveway, and seeing the porch light on, and nobody standing under it, and I told myself it didn't matter, the way I had been telling myself that same lie since I was 12 years old. College was where I first understood what it felt like to be evaluated on my own merits and nothing else, and I threw myself into it the way you throw yourself into anything you've been starving for, without realizing you were hungry. Pre-veterinary track, organic chemistry at 7 in the morning, work-study shifts at the campus stables in the afternoon, and a part-time job at an emergency vet clinic on weekends, where I learned to draw blood from a terrified cat before I ever learned how to properly write a lab report. I graduated with honors and a mountain of student loan debt that I paid down myself, one payment at a time, for the next 11 years, without ever once asking my parents for $1, because some part of me had decided very early that I would rather sleep in my car during a rough month, which I did exactly twice during vet school, than call home and hear my mother's voice go careful and distracted, the way it always did whenever I needed something. Veterinary school in Columbus nearly broke me financially and physically. 4 more years of debt stacking on top of what I already owed, 20-hour shifts during large animal rotations, a body that ached in ways I didn't know a 24-year-old body could ache. I remember standing in a barn at 4 in the morning during my equine surgery rotation, arm deep inside a mare who was foaling wrong, guided by a professor who barked instructions over the mare's labored breathing, and feeling something settle into me that I had never felt at home, the specific, solid feeling of being trusted to do something that mattered. Nobody in that barn cared whether I was the invisible daughter or the golden son. They only cared whether my hands were steady and my judgment was sound, and for the first time in my life, the only ledger that mattered was the one I was keeping with myself. While I was building that life one exhausting shift at a time, Colton was building something else back in Millbrook, though it took me years and a great deal of careful, quiet listening on holiday phone calls to understand the actual shape of it. He dropped out of Ohio University after 3 semesters and came home with a plan to open a lawn care franchise, and my parents took out a second mortgage on the house to cover the startup costs, $22,000 that Colton burned through in 14 months before the whole thing folded, leaving behind 2 mowers, a trailer, and a stack of unpaid invoices that my father quietly settled by working weekends at the hardware store for the better part of a year. My mother described it as a learning experience, and my father nodded along the way he always did when the family story needed reinforcing, and I sat at that table on my one visit home during vet school and watched them absorb a financial loss larger than my entire semester's tuition, without ever once suggesting that maybe the lesson learned should include the word no. The pattern repeated itself with such consistency over the following decade that I could have set a calendar by it. A vending machine route that lost money for 2 years before Colton walked away from it entirely. A food truck that never once turned a profit, and that my parents eventually sold at a loss just to stop paying insurance on it. A cryptocurrency investment scheme that a friend of his was running, into which my parents poured $11,000 of retirement savings that simply vanished, along with the friend, sometime around Colton's 28th birthday. Each time I heard about it secondhand, usually from my mother, in a tone that mixed worry with a strange kind of pride, as though Colton's willingness to keep failing spectacularly was itself evidence of ambition, while my own slow, unglamorous climb through veterinary school and into a stable career never earned so much as a single congratulatory phone call. I bought into a small animal and equine practice outside of Cedar Falls when I was 29, using savings I had built one modest paycheck at a time, plus a business loan I qualified for, entirely on my own credit history, which by then was spotless because I had never once co-signed for anyone or missed a payment on anything in my life. Within 3 years, I had bought out my senior partner entirely and built the practice into something with a genuine reputation. Farmers driving 45 minutes past 2 other clinics because they trusted my hands with a foaling mare more than anyone else's in the county. I bought a small brick house on a quiet street with a yard big enough for the 2 rescue dogs I'd taken in, and for the first time since I was a child, sitting at Vivian's kitchen table, I felt something that resembled peace, the specific, hard-earned peace of a life built entirely on your own foundation, with nobody else's name on the deed and nobody else's failures buried in your walls. I want to be honest with you, because this story only works if I am. I did not build that life to spite my family, though I understand now that it must have looked that way from the outside. I built it because it was the only way I knew how to survive, and somewhere along the way, survival turned into something sturdier, something that actually belonged to me. What I did not know, what I could not have known, sitting in my quiet kitchen with my dogs at my feet and my clinic's books balanced to the penny, was that my very stability, the thing I had built with my own 2 hands out of nothing anyone had given me, was about to become the exact resource my parents decided they had a right to, the moment Colton's failures finally grew too large for even them to absorb on their own. Grandma Vivian started slowing down the spring. I turned 30, and I noticed it the way you notice a change in an animal's gait before the owner ever does. A small hesitation, a missed step, nothing dramatic enough to alarm anyone who wasn't paying close attention. I was paying close attention. I drove out to Millbrook every other Sunday that year, longer than the drive really justified given my clinic schedule, because some part of me understood that the clock on our Saturday mornings among the apple trees had started running down, and I wanted every hour of it I could get. She was 78, and still sharp as a blade, still able to walk me through a column of numbers, and find the gap in it faster than I could, but her hands had started to shake, and she tired by mid-afternoon, in a way she never used to, and the doctors used words like congestive and progressive that neither of us wanted to say out loud at her kitchen table. That November, sitting across from me with a cup of tea going cold between her hands, she told me something that I turned over in my mind for months afterwards without fully understanding it. She said that she had spent the last several years quietly restructuring the orchard, moving it and its land, along with a portfolio of investments she had built up over 4 decades that nobody in the family knew existed, into an irrevocable trust, and that the trust named a sole beneficiary. She would not tell me who, only that I should trust her judgment on the matter, and that whoever it was named had earned it the hard way, through decades of being overlooked by people who should have known better. I remember laughing a little, uncomfortable in the way you get when a conversation edges toward money and death in the same breath, and telling her I didn't need anything from her, that just having her Saturday mornings had been more than enough. She reached across the table and took my hand, and her grip was still strong even though the shaking hadn't stopped, and she said, "Renee, I am not doing this because you need it. I am doing this because you are the only person in this family who has never once asked me for a single thing, and that is exactly why you deserve to have something nobody can ever take away from you." She passed away the following March, quietly, in her sleep, in the same farmhouse where she had raised my father, and where she had spent every Saturday morning of my childhood, teaching me to read a ledger like it was scripture. I found out from a neighbor before I found out from my own parents, because my mother, it turned out, had waited 2 full days to call me, a delay she later explained by saying she hadn't wanted to ruin my week at the clinic, though I have never once believed that was the real reason. At the funeral, I sat in the second row beside my father, who cried in a way I had genuinely never seen him cry before, and across the aisle my mother dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue she never seemed to actually need, and Colton stood near the back checking his phone twice during the eulogy, and I remember thinking, watching all 3 of them, that I was the only person in that church who had actually known the woman we were burying. 3 weeks after the funeral, an envelope arrived at my clinic, addressed in Vivian's own careful handwriting, the kind of handwriting you don't see much anymore, and inside was a letter, along with a small brass key, and instructions to visit a lawyer named Marguerite Aldous in Zanesville, whose office I had never heard of, and whose name I did not recognize. The letter was short, and I have read it so many times that I could recite it in my sleep. She wrote that if I was reading it, she was already gone, and that the trust she had mentioned that November afternoon at her kitchen table was mine, all of it, the orchard, the land, and an investment account that had grown far larger than either of us had ever discussed out loud. She wrote that she was not leaving it to me to make my life easier, because my life, she said, had never needed easing, only recognizing. She wrote one more line that I did not fully understand until months later, sitting under a linen napkin in a ballroom in Cedar Falls. She wrote, "They will come for this eventually, Renee, because people who have spent a lifetime taking will always assume there is more to take, and when they come, I want you to already know exactly what belongs to you." I met with Marguerite that same week, and she was exactly as Vivian had described her in the letter, sharp-eyed, unhurried, the kind of lawyer who says exactly what needs saying and nothing more. She confirmed the trust, walked me through the documents, and explained that it was fully irrevocable, and had been structured years earlier specifically so that no family member could contest it or claim any portion through inheritance law. She also told me something that made the back of my neck go cold in a way I still remember clearly. She said that 6 months before Vivian passed, someone claiming to be a family representative had called her office asking detailed questions about the orchard's ownership structure and whether any loans could be secured against family assets still held informally. She had refused to give out any information, she said, because the trust was already fully executed by then, and none of it was any of that caller's business. But she had made a note of the date and the number, and she suggested, gently, that I might want to start paying closer attention to my own financial records going forward. I did not think much of it at the time. Grief has a way of dulling your instincts even when you're a person who was raised to read a room for danger. But over the following months, small things started happening that I filed away without quite connecting them. A letter arrived from a bank I had never done business with, addressed to me, thanking me for my continued partnership on an account I had no memory of opening. I called the bank, and the representative, after some confusion, told me the account had been opened using my social security number, roughly 8 months earlier, and that it was in good standing, whatever that meant. I asked what kind of account. She said it was tied to a business line of credit. Co-signed, and when I asked co-signed with whom, there was a pause on the line before she read me a name I already knew before she finished saying it. Around that same time, my mother started calling more often than she had in years. Warm calls, chatty calls, asking about the clinic, asking about my house, asking, almost in passing, whether I'd been following the news about interest rates and whether I thought this was a good time to refinance anything. Colton texted me twice that spring, which was itself unusual enough to notice, once to ask how business was going, and once, strangely, to ask whether I still had the same bank I'd used since vet school. I answered both texts the way I answered everything from my family by then, politely, briefly, and without giving away more than I had to, because somewhere underneath the surface of my ordinary life, the same instinct Vivian had spent years training in me over Saturday mornings at her kitchen table had started quietly sounding an alarm, telling me that the gap between what my family was saying and what my family was actually doing had opened wide enough that I needed to start paying very, very close attention to where it led. I called the bank back 3 days later, the one that had sent the thank you letter for a line of credit I never opened, and this time, I asked for everything they could send me in writing, every application document, every signature page, every piece of paper with my name on it. It took 2 more phone calls and a fax number that felt like something out of another decade before a manila envelope arrived at my clinic, addressed to me personally, and I sat at my desk after closing hours that night, with my 2 dogs asleep on the floor beside me, and opened it with hands that were steadier than I expected them to be, because somewhere underneath the shock, Vivian's voice was already in my head, telling me to read the numbers before I let myself feel anything about them. The application inside was for a business line of credit totaling $60,000, filed 8 months earlier under the name of a company called Castellan Outdoor Solutions LLC, which I had never heard of, and which, a quick search that same night told me, had been registered in Ohio only 9 months before that, listing Colton as managing member. My name appeared as a personal guarantor on the loan, my social security number, my date of birth, an address that was actually my address, and a signature at the bottom of the 3rd page that was close enough to fool a loan officer who had never seen my handwriting before, but wrong in exactly the place I told you about earlier, the loop on the R curling backward instead of forward. A small, careless mistake made by someone who had clearly practiced my signature from an old birthday card or a piece of mail rather than ever actually watching me write my own name. I sat with that envelope open on my desk for a long time that night, and I want to tell you honestly that my first instinct was not anger. It was a kind of cold, clinical grief, the same feeling I get sometimes in surgery when I open up an animal and find something far worse than what the imaging showed. A moment where you have to set your emotions aside completely and just work the problem in front of you because the problem does not care how you feel about it. I thought about calling my parents that night and demanding an explanation, And then I thought about Vivian's letter. The line about people who have spent a lifetime taking, always assuming there is more to take, and I understood that if I called now, hot and unprepared, I would hand them exactly the kind of chaotic, emotional confrontation they had spent 30 years training me to avoid starting, and they would have 3 days to build a story around it before I ever got the truth. Instead, I called Marguerite Aldous the next morning, and she listened to the entire thing without interrupting once. The same steady, patient quality Vivian must have valued in her all those years, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before she told me plainly that what I was describing was almost certainly loan fraud, forgery of a legal document, and identity theft, all three, and that the smartest thing I could do was not confront anyone yet, but instead build a complete, documented picture of exactly what had happened before I said a single word to my family. She connected me with a forensic document examiner named Otis Reyes, a quiet, methodical man who worked out of an office in Columbus, and over the following 2 weeks, I drove up there twice, bringing every piece of paper I could gather, old birthday cards with my handwriting on them, my actual notarized signature from my clinic's lease agreement, the forged loan documents themselves, and Otis confirmed within days what I already suspected, that the signature was a forgery, competent but not expert, made by someone working from limited samples of my real handwriting. While Otis worked, I did my own digging the way Vivian had taught me, following the gap between what the paperwork said and what had actually happened, and the picture that emerged over those 2 weeks made my stomach turn in a way that surgery never has. Castellan Outdoor Solutions LLC had been registered 9 months earlier, right around the time Colton's food truck venture had finally, fully collapsed under a mountain of unpaid supplier invoices. The $60,000 line of credit had been drawn down almost entirely within the first 4 months, most of it funneled into equipment purchases for a landscaping business that, according to public records, had already stopped renewing its city permits 2 months before the wedding, meaning the business was functionally dead, while the debt against my name was very much still alive and accruing interest every single day. I found late payment notices in that file, 3 of them, each one addressed to me at my own home address, notices that I had never received because, as I discovered through one more phone call, someone had filed a change of mailing address request with that bank shortly after the account was opened, rerouting all correspondence to a post office box in Millbrook that I did not have access to. The most damning piece came almost by accident, during a phone call I made to the notary listed on the guarantee document, a woman working out of a UPS store in Millbrook who, when I described the situation gently and without accusation, admitted after some hesitation that she vaguely remembered notarizing a document for a man who told her his sister couldn't be present because she was traveling for work, and that he had her identification with him, and that she had, against her better judgment, and because he seemed so certain and so pleasant about the whole thing, notarized it anyway, without requiring the actual signer to appear. She would not confirm it was Colton over the phone, not without a formal request from an attorney, but she did not have to, because by then I had already built enough of a picture that the shape of it was unmistakable. My brother, quietly, methodically, had stolen my identity to save a business that was already dying, using my name as collateral without ever once asking me, confident, the way he had been confident his entire life, that either I would never find out, or that if I did, our parents would smooth it over the way they had smoothed over every single one of his failures since he was 9 years old. Marguerite helped me put together everything Otis had confirmed, the forged signature, the rerouted mailing address, the notary's account, and the full paper trail of the loan itself, into a single folder, organized the way Vivian had taught me to organize a ledger, clean, chronological, undeniable. She told me I had 2 paths in front of me. I could take this straight to the police and to the bank's fraud department immediately, which would almost certainly end with criminal charges against my own brother, or I could wait, hold the folder, and see whether my family gave me one more chance to handle this quietly, on my own terms, in a room where the truth could not be talked away or smoothed over by my mother's careful smile. I told her I wanted to wait, not out of mercy, but because some part of me needed to see, one final time, exactly how far they were willing to go before they thought anyone was watching. I did not know yet that the answer to that question would arrive 3 weeks later, folded in thirds, hidden under a linen napkin at table 16. I want to take you back into that ballroom now, because everything I've told you so far was the quiet part, the part nobody in my family ever saw me building, and what happened next was the part 200 witnesses watched unfold in real time. I stood beside my mother's chair at table 1, with the folder resting on the white tablecloth beside her wine glass, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all, the string quartet still playing somewhere behind me, as though the room hadn't just tilted on its axis. My mother recovered first, the way she always did, reaching for the folder with a light laugh and saying, "Renee, honey, whatever this is, can it wait? We're in the middle of your brother's wedding." And I put my hand flat on top of the folder before she could open it, and I said, "No, Mom, it can't, because I found this under my napkin tonight, and I think everyone at this table deserves to know what it is." I opened it myself. I did not raise my voice, and I did not need to, because the room had already started going quiet around us, the way a room does when it senses something real is happening, instead of the usual performance. I took out the loan guarantee first and laid it on the table facing my mother, and I said, "This is a $60,000 line of credit taken out 8 months ago under a company called Castellan Outdoor Solutions, with my name as the guarantor, my social security number, and a signature at the bottom that is not mine." My father's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. Colton, up at the head table in his rented tuxedo, had gone very still, the particular stillness of a man doing math in his head and not liking the answer. I laid the second document beside it, the forensic examiner's report, Otis Reyes's careful, technical language confirming that the signature did not match my authenticated handwriting samples in 11 separate points of comparison. My mother tried the smile one more time, the warm, brittle smile she used whenever a story was slipping out of her control, and she said, "Renee, I'm sure there's an explanation. Families help each other, and I think that's when something in me that had been coiled tight for 21 years finally released, not into anger, but into a calm so complete it frightened me a little even as I felt it." I said, "Families help each other when they ask first, Mom," and then I laid the third document on the table, the notary's signed statement that Marguerite had obtained 2 days earlier, confirming that the guarantor had never appeared in person to sign the document, that a man matching Colton's description had presented my identification and told her I was traveling for work. Somewhere behind me, I heard a chair scrape back hard against the floor, and I turned to see Colton standing, his new bride Paige staring up at him with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, confusion sliding into horror in real time. "Colton, this is insane," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "You can't just— This is my wedding." And I looked at him, really looked at him, the way I hadn't allowed myself to in years, and I said, "You used my name to save a business that was already dead, Colton. And you did it 8 months ago, and you let me find out about it under a napkin at your own reception, so please don't tell me what I can and cannot do tonight." My father finally spoke, his voice small and strange in a way I had never heard it, asking whether this was really true, was Colton, and Colton's silence in that moment answered the question more completely than any words could have, because a man with a real explanation does not stand frozen with his mouth open while 200 guests wait for him to speak. That was when my mother made her last attempt, and I want you to understand, this was the moment that finally, completely severed something in me that had been holding on by threads for years. She looked at the documents spread across the tablecloth, then up at me, and she said, quietly but clearly enough for the nearby tables to hear, "Renee, you have always had so much. The clinic, the house. You could afford to help your brother. Why does this have to become a whole scene?" I felt the old floor of my childhood open up beneath that sentence, the entire architecture of it. The report card nobody looked at, the assembly nobody attended, 21 years of being told that my success made my exploitation acceptable, and I picked up the fourth and final document from the folder, the one I had been saving, the one Marguerite had drawn up specifically for this possibility. It was a certified copy of Vivian's trust, the one naming me sole beneficiary of the orchard, and everything attached to it, and beneath it, a letter I had asked Marguerite to help me draft that same week. A formal notice that I would be pursuing full legal action against Colton for fraud and identity theft. Filed that morning, already in motion, no longer a threat but a fact. I set it down in front of my mother, and I said, "This is not a scene, Mom. This is what happens when you spend 21 years deciding I don't matter enough to protect, and then decide I matter exactly enough to steal from." I did not raise my voice once through the entire thing, and that, more than anything, seemed to be what finally broke the room's silence, because a hush that complete cannot hold forever, and it shattered into a wave of murmurs and gasps rolling outward, table by table, as guests who had spent the whole evening admiring the flowers and the string quartet realized they were witnessing something entirely different than the wedding they'd been invited to. Paige stood up from the head table in her wedding dress, tears already streaking down her face, and she looked at Colton with an expression that told me, even in that chaotic moment, that whatever their marriage had just become would never again be what either of them had planned walking into that ballroom. My father put his head in his hands. My mother sat frozen with her hands still hovering over the documents, unable to pick them up and unable to look away from them, and somewhere in the back of that grand room, an officiant who had performed the ceremony 2 hours earlier quietly excused himself from a conversation and slipped toward the exit, the way people do when they sense a room has become something they no longer want to be photographed inside of. I picked my folder back up, closed it, and I said one more thing before I turned to leave, the only sentence in the whole confrontation I had planned, the one Vivian's voice had given me years earlier at her kitchen table. I said, "I hope the wedding was everything you wanted it to be, because it's the last thing this family gets from me without an explanation first." And then I walked out of that ballroom into the cold October air, and I did not look back once to see what was happening behind me. The days after the wedding moved fast in a way I hadn't fully prepared myself for, even after weeks of quietly building the case in the background with Marguerite. I had filed the fraud report the morning of the reception, timed deliberately so that by the time my family found out what I knew, the wheels were already turning somewhere far outside their control, and there was no version of that night where a warm enough phone call or a well-timed apology could make it stop. The bank's fraud department opened its own investigation within the week, and because Otis Reyes's forensic report was airtight, and the notary had already given a signed statement, it did not take them long to freeze the line of credit entirely and formally notify me in writing that I bore no financial liability for any portion of the $60,000, that the debt would instead be pursued directly against Colton and the LLC he had registered in his own name. Colton was charged 3 weeks later with forgery and identity theft, both felonies under Ohio law, and I want to be honest with you about how that news landed, because it was not the clean, satisfying justice you might expect from a story like this. I sat in my kitchen with my dogs at my feet when Marguerite called to tell me the charges had been filed, and I cried, not out of guilt exactly, but out of the strange grief of watching a life you once shared a bedroom wall with collapse in slow motion because of choices that had nothing to do with you and everything to do with a family that had spent 30 years teaching him he would never have to face real consequences. Colton eventually took a plea deal, avoiding prison in exchange for probation, mandatory restitution, and a felony record that would follow him for the rest of his life, closing doors that had never once been closed to him before, and for the first time in 3 decades, nobody in my family was there to quietly absorb the fallout on his behalf. Paige filed for an annulment 11 days after the wedding, and I heard through Marguerite, who had heard it through the small-town grapevine that moves faster than any lawyer's office, that she had discovered on their honeymoon that Colton had also taken out a second, smaller loan under her father's name, without telling either of them. A detail that came out only after the first scandal cracked the whole facade open. I felt for her in a way I hadn't expected to. A woman who had married into a story about a golden son that had been carefully polished for 30 years by people who never once let the tarnish show, and who found out on her honeymoon that the whole thing had been built on the same kind of quiet theft that had almost cost me my clinic, my house, and my entire financial future. My parents' reaction in the weeks that followed told me everything I needed to know about whether anything in that family had actually changed. My mother called 4 times in the first week, and each message grew a little less warm and a little more accusatory, moving from Renee, "Please call me back. We need to talk about this as a family," to Renee, "You have humiliated us in front of everyone we know, and I hope you're happy," as though the humiliation had originated with me setting a folder on a tablecloth, rather than with her son forging my signature on a legal document 8 months earlier. My father called only once, and his voicemail was different, quieter, and he said something I have listened to more times than I probably should admit, that he was sorry, that he had known for years something wasn't right in how they'd raised the two of us, and that he hadn't dared to say so until it was far too late to matter. I have not called him back yet. I am not sure when, or if, I will. Marguerite helped me finalize the transfer of Vivian's trust into my full legal control that same month, and standing in that quiet office in Zanesville with the orchard deed finally, completely in my own name, I understood something Vivian must have known the entire time she was quietly restructuring her estate over those final years. She had not built that trust to give me an escape from my family. She had built it to give me proof, undeniable and irrevocable, that someone in that family had seen exactly who I was the whole time, and had decided, deliberately and with great care, that I was worth protecting even when nobody else in that house ever thought to. The community around Millbrook and Cedar Falls, small as it was, moved the way small communities always do once a story like this gets loose, and within a month, it seemed like everyone within 30 miles had heard some version of what happened at that wedding. Farmers who brought their livestock into my clinic started mentioning it gently, almost apologetically, the way people do when they want you to know they're on your side without making you relive the details, and I found, to my genuine surprise, that the story did not damage my reputation the way I had quietly feared it might. If anything, it did the opposite, because people in that part of Ohio understand exactly what it means to build something with your own 2 hands, and they understand exactly what it means when someone tries to take it from you. By the time winter came, my clinic was busier than it had ever been, my financial name was fully cleared and permanently protected by a paper trail so thorough that no bank in the state would ever again mistake a forgery for my real signature, and the orchard sat quiet under its first snow of the season, 12 acres that had once been the only place in my entire childhood where somebody had looked at me and seen something worth keeping. I drove out there most Sundays that winter, alone, walking the same rows of trees where Vivian had taught me to read a ledger, and I understood, standing in that cold quiet, that the folder I had carried into that ballroom had never really been about revenge at all. It had been about finally, completely, refusing to let anyone in that family write my story for me one more time. Spring came to the orchard the way it always had. Slow at first and then all at once, 12 acres of bare branches suddenly heavy with white blossoms in the space of what felt like a single warm week, and I stood among the trees that April with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, thinking about how strange it was that the place which had once been my only refuge from an entire family's indifference had become, without my ever quite planning it that way, the foundation of an entirely new life. I had spent the winter deciding what to do with land I never expected to actually own, and by the time the blossoms came in, I had my answer. One that I think would have made Vivian smile in that quiet, satisfied way she used to smile when a column of numbers finally balanced out exactly as it should. I did not sell the orchard, though Marguerite gently mentioned early on that I could. That 12 acres of prime agricultural land near a growing town like Cedar Falls would fetch a high price from any number of developers, circling that part of the county. I thought about it for exactly one afternoon before I understood that selling it would mean selling the only physical place where somebody in my family had ever actually shown up for me. Every single Saturday, for years, without ever once being asked to. Instead, I kept the orchard running, hired a small crew to help manage the harvest properly, and used a portion of the investment portfolio Vivian had built to establish something I named simply the Vivian Castellan Fund, a small scholarship for veterinary students from rural Ohio who, like me, had grown up with more determination than money and needed exactly one person willing to bet on them the way my grandmother had bet on me at a kitchen table with apple crates stacked against the wall. My relationship with my parents settled into something neither warm nor entirely cold, a careful, distant politeness that I suspect is the most honest version of what we ever actually had, even in the years when I believed it was something more. My mother stopped calling sometime around the following summer, and I understood that silence for exactly what it was. Not peace, but the particular kind of quiet that settles over a person who has finally realized there is no version of the story where she gets to be the one who was wronged. My father and I talk occasionally now, brief, careful phone calls every few months, and I have come to believe that his apology, imperfect and years too late as it was, came from somewhere real, even if real regret and actual repair turned out to be two very different things that his generation never quite learned how to bridge. I have made my peace with the fact that peace, in this case, does not mean reconciliation. It simply means I no longer wait by a phone that isn't going to ring the way I used to. Colton and I have not spoken since the night I walked out of that ballroom, and I do not know if we ever will again, though I think about him more than I expected to, especially on the Saturdays I still drive out to the orchard alone. I do not hate my brother. I understand him now in a way I could not have understood him at 12 years old watching him get comforted for a suspension while my report card sat unremarked upon on the kitchen counter. Because I have finally seen clearly what 30 years of never facing a real consequence does to a person, how it hollows out the part of you that is supposed to develop the strength to survive your own mistakes, and leaves behind someone who reaches instinctively for whatever is nearest and easiest to take when the walls finally close in. That understanding does not excuse what he did. It simply lets me set the anger down somewhere I can walk away from, which is a different thing entirely from forgiveness, and I think that difference matters more than people usually admit. I still practice at my clinic 4 days a week, still get called out at 3 in the morning for a difficult foaling, still love the specific, steady satisfaction of a job that judges me only on the quality of my hands and the soundness of my judgment, nothing else. My house on the quiet street still has 2 dogs sleeping at the foot of my bed most nights, and the mortgage on it is entirely mine, paid faithfully, with no one else's name anywhere on the deed. But it is the orchard that changed something fundamental in how I understand my own life, because standing among those trees, I finally understood the full weight of what my grandmother had been trying to tell me all those Saturday mornings when I was too young to fully grasp it. She used to say that numbers refuse to lie to you, that if you want to know the truth about a person, you look at where their money goes, and I think now that she meant something larger than accounting when she said it, that she meant you look at where a person's attention goes, where their care goes, where they choose, again and again, quietly and without being asked, to show up for you. If there is a single thing I hope you take from everything I have told you tonight, it is this. The family that raises you does not automatically earn the right to define your worth, no matter how many years they spend trying to convince you otherwise, through silence, or through a folding chair pushed back behind a support column, or through a signature forged carefully enough to fool a stranger, but never quite carefully enough to fool the truth. Sometimes the person who finally sees you clearly is not the parent who is supposed to, and sometimes the inheritance that actually matters is not the money at all, but the simple, steady example of someone who looked at you exactly as you were and decided, without hesitation, that you were worth protecting. I found that example at a kitchen table with apple crates stacked against the wall, and I carried it with me into a ballroom 21 years later, and I am carrying it still, Every single Sunday, I walk those 12 acres and watch the trees my grandmother planted keep doing exactly what they have always done, growing steady and quiet and entirely on their own terms, no matter who once doubted they would. If this story meant something to you tonight, if you have ever been the folding chair by the kitchen door in your own family's story, I want you to know you are not alone, and I would love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments if you have ever had to set your own folder down on someone else's table, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. If this reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories like this one, because the truth, laid out calmly and completely, is always louder than anyone's raised voice. And I will see you in the next story.